May 5, 1945. The war in Europe was over, on paper. But high in the Austrian Alps, the air still smelled of cordite and snow melt, and somewhere between the pine trees and the clouds stood a castle that refused to surrender to peace. Itter Castle, a medieval fortress carved into a ridge above the village of the same name. Gray walls, arrow slits, a gate that looked like it hadn't been opened since knights rode instead of tanks. Below it, the valley rolled with fog. Above, the peaks glowed pale blue under a sky too clean for war. But the men inside knew the world wasn't finished with them yet. The prisoners had been moved here from Dachau months before, special inmates, prominent. The SS had called them. 10 Frenchmen who had once ruled a nation. Former prime ministers, generals, ministers, even a tennis champion. They had lived their lives under marble ceilings and flags. Now they slept on straw in the castle's old banquet hall. Among them was Paul Reynaud, the man who had tried to stop France's surrender in 1940, Edouard Daladier, who had signed it, and General Gamelin, who had led the army that collapsed. Old enemies sharing cold soup and fear. They had heard the news 2 days earlier. Germany had surrendered. But here, the war was still breathing, a wounded animal thrashing in its last hours. Outside the gates, the SS still prowled the hills, loyal to nothing except vengeance. Their guards, half-starved and desperate, had stopped saluting weeks ago. Then, sometime in the night, they vanished, slipping away with their rifles, leaving the prisoners alone inside the stone shell of the castle. At dawn, the French gathered in the courtyard, uncertain what freedom meant when surrounded by mountains and ghosts. The air smelled of damp stone and gun oil. The wooden gate creaked like a jaw ready to speak. "Perhaps they're gone," Daladier said. "Perhaps we are free." No one answered. Freedom, they had learned, was a rumor until proven otherwise. The cook, a Czech forced into service, climbed the tower to look. Through his binoculars, he saw smoke, thin threads rising from the village below, and movement. Trucks, men in black. SS, he said. The word fell like a stone into a well. The castle was empty of guards, empty of soldiers, empty of food. But the enemy was still out there, regrouping, angry, alive. "They told us the Americans were near," Reynaud would later write in his journal. But we could already hear the SS loading their guns. They debated what to do. Barricade the gate? Run to the woods? Send someone for help? Gamelin insisted on defense. "We are still soldiers," he said, but there were only 2 working rifles left in the whole castle. The others were museum pieces, relics on the wall. "Then we die as relics," he muttered. It was meant as defiance, but it sounded like prophecy. By noon, they could hear the first bursts of gunfire in the valley. Sharp cracks, uneven, closer than before. A handful of resistance fighters had fled into the hills and were being hunted down. From the tower, the cook saw a group of men running along the road, chased by black-clad figures. He couldn't tell who was who. The distance flattened everything into motion and smoke. Inside, the French gathered whatever they could use as weapons. Table legs, fire pokers, a few grenades stolen weeks earlier from a guard's footlocker. The tennis champion, Jean Barotra, volunteered to climb over the wall and try to reach the Americans rumored to be at Kufstein, 5 miles away. "It's suicide," someone said. He smiled. "Then I'll die running, not waiting." They tied a rope from a window, and he slipped into the trees like a shadow. Hours passed. The castle breathed with them, timbers creaking, walls sweating moisture. They could hear the SS down below now, voices echoing in German, barking orders. One of the Frenchmen began to pray. Another laughed, softly, almost kindly, and said, "You think God knows which side to choose anymore?" The sun fell behind the peaks. The air turned cold and electric. Then came the first sound that didn't belong to this dying corner of war. An engine. Low, heavy, deliberate. A rumble that rolled through the valley like a promise. The French froze, straining to listen. The guards on the wall peered down the winding road that climbed toward the gate. Headlights flickered between the pines. A vehicle crawled into view, olive drab, not black. A tank. Its barrel pointed toward the ground, its treads crunching the gravel. And from its antenna fluttered a white cloth. Inside the castle, the men looked at one another, uncertain whether to cheer or hide. A tank meant soldiers. Soldiers meant someone's army. But whose? The engine stopped. The turret turned slightly, as if sniffing the wind. Then a hatch opened, and a figure climbed out, a man in a Wehrmacht uniform, his hands raised, empty. He shouted something in German, voice cracking in the cold air. The echo came back softer. Nicht schießen. Nicht schießen. Don't shoot. The gate guard leaned out, rifle shaking. What does he want? Someone asked. No one knew. Then they heard it, clearly this time. The man's voice raw from shouting. I need to speak to an American. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The castle, the mountains, even the birds went silent. Outside the walls of an ancient fortress, in the last hours of a finished war, an enemy had come not to kill, but to ask for help. And the men inside didn't yet know it. But that voice, one man's voice, had just begun the strangest alliance of the Second World War. Because the German wasn't there to fight them. He was there to save them. And behind him, down in the valley, the SS were already on the march. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The man who knocked on the castle gate wore a Wehrmacht uniform, mud-caked, frayed at the cuffs, the insignia half torn away. His name was Major Joseph Gangel, and by the time he reached Itter, he had already stopped thinking of himself as a soldier. The war was collapsing like wet paper around him. In the valleys below, roads were jammed with refugees, carts piled with children and goats, whole families walking beside wagons marked with chalk crosses. The SS still prowled the highways, shooting deserters, hanging them from telephone poles with cardboard signs reading traitor. Gangel had seen 3 that morning on his way from Wurgel, boys, really, still in uniform, boots too large for their feet. He had 20 men left from his artillery company. 20 men, 1 truck, and an oath that meant nothing now. He'd spent the night hiding them in barns, arguing by candlelight about what duty meant when the Reich was ash. By dawn, he made his decision. They would surrender to the Americans. And not quietly. They would help them. His logbook, found years later, carried a single line in blunt pencil. I have had enough of this war. When the castle gates groaned open, the prisoners stared from behind the iron bars like ghosts, uncertain whether to vanish or speak. The white flag on the tank's antenna fluttered weakly in the mountain wind. Gangel raised both hands. I am not SS, he shouted in rough English. I come to find Americans. There are French prisoners here. The SS will kill them. At first, no one believed him. They had seen too many uniforms, too many tricks. But one of the Czech orderlies recognized his badge. Artillery, not SS, and nodded. He's telling the truth, the man said. I've heard of him. Wurgel garrison. Gangel lowered his voice. My men and I want to help. But we cannot hold the castle alone. He glanced toward the tree line. Smoke curled there, lazy but dark. They are coming. We must find the Americans before night. Inside, the French debated. Trust a German? Even one running from his own? Daladier called it madness. Reynaud disagreed. Madness, he said, is dying in a castle while the world celebrates peace. Gangel didn't wait for their decision. He left 2 of his men at the gate and climbed back into his Kubel wagon, the engine coughing as it started downhill. He drove through the winding road to the river, to the place where the German front had already dissolved into rumors and fear. He found them near Kufstein, an American patrol guarding a bridge, men in dusty uniforms leaning against a Sherman tank nicknamed Besotten Jenny. Its commander, Captain John C. Lee of the 23rd Tank Battalion, was 27 and looked older. When the German jeep rolled into sight, guns snapped to aim before the vehicle even stopped. Gangel stepped out slowly, hands raised. I am Major Gangel, formerly of the Wehrmacht, he said. I seek parley. The Americans surrounded him. One shouted, You expect me to believe a Kraut wants to fight the SS with us? Lee walked forward, eyes narrowed. His sidearm stayed holstered, but his tone was iron. You got 5 seconds to make sense, Major. Gangel told him everything. The castle, the French dignitaries, the SS assembling in the woods. He spoke quickly, the words tumbling through fatigue. If you come now, we can hold them off. If you wait, they will be slaughtered. They will be trophies before the peace is even signed. Lee studied him. Behind the young officer, the tank's gunner spat into the dirt. Sounds like bait, he muttered. Maybe it should have been. But Lee had seen enough war to recognize the tremor in Gangel's voice. Not fear, conscience. That rare, contagious thing that survived even after orders stopped mattering. He turned to his sergeant. We've got what, 14 men? 14, sir. And Jenny. Lee looked back at the German. All right. One day? We fight together, for one day. The handshake that followed was quick, almost clumsy, but history rarely pauses for ceremony. The alliance was sealed on a dirt road under a sky that smelled of rain. They left at once. 14 Americans, 10 Germans, 1 tank, and a truck of ammunition. Gangel's men, stripped of insignia, followed the Sherman like shadows. The route wound through apple orchards and empty villages, roofs still smoking from retreating SS squads. They passed civilians hiding in cellars, peering through cracks in the doors. To them, the sight must have looked like madness, enemy soldiers marching side by side. By evening, the convoy reached Wurgel. Gangel ordered his men to stay and protect the townspeople from SS reprisals. No more executions, he said, voice flat. Not here. Then he and a handful of Americans rolled on toward Itter, the tank's treads crushing gravel, the sky bleeding violet behind the peaks. They drove in silence, both sides avoiding questions that had no clean answers. Lee checked his carbine. Gangel lit a cigarette, the glow flickering against his hollow cheeks. At one point, Lee said quietly, "You ever think history will believe this?" Gangel exhaled smoke through his nose. "Maybe that's why we have to do it." Night came cold. The forest pressed close. Somewhere ahead, hidden in that darkness, lay the last fight of a war already declared over. In the castle above, the French prisoners listened to the echo of distant engines climbing the road and argued about what they were hearing. "Germans," said one. "Americans," said another. A third whispered, "Maybe both." At dawn, when the first light reached the valley, they saw them. Black uniforms moving along the ridge, rifles glinting in the early sun. The SS had arrived. And behind them, somewhere on that winding road, came an impossible army. Americans and Germans, allies for a single day, driving toward a medieval fortress that no one was supposed to die for. The battle for Castle Itter was about to begin. The road was quiet. Too quiet. Gangel rode in the lead jeep, collar up, scanning the dark tree-line. "If they know we're coming," he muttered, "we won't make it halfway." Behind him, the Sherman tank rumbled low, its engine steady like a heart that refused to panic. The column, 14 Americans, 10 Germans, 1 tank, 1 ammo truck, moved through the narrow valley under a lid of cloud. The air smelled of rain, smoke, and pine. Abandoned carts lined the roadside, wheels sunk in mud. In the fields, refugees huddled in barns with lamps covered, watching this strange army pass, enemies marching together. Captain Lee sat on the tank's turret, rifle across his knees. The metal was slick with mist. He could hear the creak of the treads, the whisper of boots, the way sound carried too far when everyone feared it. Gangel raised a hand. "Halt." Ahead, 3 bodies swung from a telephone pole, SS warnings scrawled on cardboard. Lee cursed under his breath. Gangel stepped out, cut them down, and said nothing. They moved again, slower. The forest pressed close, swallowing the edges of the road. Each bend could hide an ambush. Every rock looked like a rifle barrel. The men barely spoke. Even the engines seemed to whisper. In the castle above, the French prisoners woke to the echo of distant engines. "Germans," someone said. "Americans," another argued. "Maybe both," murmured Reynaud. They waited by the windows, straining to hear which flag would come with the dawn. On the ridge, SS scouts were already in position. They had seen the convoy and radioed for reinforcements. Their orders were simple: retake the castle, kill everyone inside. The hills went still again, as if holding its breath before the strike. At a fork in the road, Lee crouched over a map. "You're sure this goat trail can hold her weight?" he asked. Gangel looked at the Sherman. "It's held armies for centuries. Tonight it holds one more." The tank crawled forward, grinding through mud. Its treads slipped, caught, and scraped against the rock with a shriek that made the men flinch. When it cleared the bend, they exhaled as one. For a moment, the war seemed to pause. A woman appeared in the doorway of a farmhouse, holding a child. She saw Germans walking beside Americans and didn't move, just stared, as if witnessing something that should not exist. Lee lifted a hand in silent greeting. She didn't return it. Inside Itter, the French argued about defense. "We barricade," said Gamelin. "With what?" replied another. "They stack tables, wine barrels, anything that could stop a bullet or delay the inevitable. Someone found a musket on the wall, laughed, and set it by the door. "If this war ever ends," he said, "I'll sell it for firewood." Archival notes later called it absurd. 14 Americans, 10 Germans, 1 tank named Besotten Jenny, facing over 100 SS troops. A fortress built in the Middle Ages now preparing for its strangest battle. The column stopped again. A tree had been felled across the road, a warning or a test. The men climbed down, cutting through branches. The German scouts returned with empty hands but uneasy eyes. "They're close," one said. The forest offered no answer, only the hiss of rain on leaves. The first light of dawn crept into the valley. The castle appeared ahead, gray walls shining wet, its towers rising from mist. On the parapet, a figure waved both arms, calling them forward. Relief surged through the column. Then, behind them, movement, dark shapes slipping between trees, rifles catching light. The SS were coming. Lee gave the signal. The Sherman's engine roared, echoing off the cliffs. The men broke into a run, pushing through the gate as bullets cracked through the morning air. Inside, the French shouted from the courtyard, disbelief turning to joy, then fear again. The gate slammed shut, wood splintering under fire. Dawn climbed higher, painting the valley blood orange. On the ridge, black uniforms took position. In the courtyard, Americans and Germans scrambled side by side, loading rifles, manning the tank, dragging sandbags into place. The battle for Castle Itter had begun. The first shot came from the forest. It wasn't aimed at soldiers, it hit the castle gate. Wood exploded in a sharp splinter, iron rang, and everyone froze for half a breath before the second shot came. Then a third. The fog over the valley peeled away, revealing the slope below crawling with movement, shadows in black uniforms slipping between trees. The siege had begun. Morning climbed slow through the pines. The courtyard smelled of wet stone, coffee gone cold, and oil from the Sherman tank. Lee barked orders from the wall, his voice cutting through the echo. "Positions. Don't waste ammo. We're outnumbered 20-1. Men ran, boots hammering the stone. Americans and Germans took their posts side by side. In the tower, a Wehrmacht gunner fed belts into a captured MG-34, his hands shaking but precise. Beside him, a U.S. sergeant fired short bursts, the two moving like gears that had finally found each other. The first MG-42 burst from the forest tore into the upper battlement, spraying stone chips into the courtyard. The air filled with the smell of cordite and old dust. Bullets smacked the walls like fists. The Czech cook, who'd never fired a gun before, pressed his back to a column, clutching a rifle that felt heavier than it should. When he saw a shape in the trees, he pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, smoke bit his eyes, and he laughed once, nervous and relieved to still be alive. In the great hall, the French prisoners argued over what to do until General Maurice Gamelin simply stood, straight-backed and calm. He lifted an old rifle from a crate and checked the chamber. "If I die today," he said, "at least it won't be in a cell." No one answered. They just followed him to the wall. The MGs kept singing their steel hymn. The Sherman's turret turned toward the forest and answered with a low, deliberate roar. Its shell tore into the hillside, shaking the earth, sending trees into the air like matchsticks. The echo bounced off the mountains and came back sounding like thunder. "Left flank, 2 squads moving," Gangle shouted. "They're looking for ladders." Lee raised his binoculars, saw flashes of black, and yelled down. Short bursts. "Make 'em pay to climb." The defenders learned to move with the rhythm of survival. Fire, duck, reload, breathe. Every shot felt personal. Spent shells rolled across the stone floor, tinkling like coins. The cook reloaded from trembling fingers. The tennis champion Barotra took a position beside him, grinning through sweat. "Breathe, aim low," he said. "Let the earth catch what you miss." A mortar round hit the corner tower, showering the courtyard in dust and sparks. The Sherman shuddered but held its place, its cokes chewing through the tree-ling. Smoke rolled down from the hills, heavy and acrid. Somewhere, a French minister began to pray, not loudly, just a steady murmur that sounded like counting. Then, silence. It came sudden and wrong. No gunfire. Only the distant click of a jammed weapon and the mountain wind pushing through the gate. The men froze, listening. The quiet pressed into their ears like fingers. Gangle looked through his scope. "They're testing us," he said softly. "Next time, it won't be a probe." In that pause, the castle remembered how to breathe. Tin cups passed from hand to hand. A cigarette made its way along the parapet, German to American to Frenchman. No one spoke. They just shared the smoke and the silence. The second wave came harder. Rifles, grenades, a Panzerfaust screaming through the air. It hit the wall just left of the gate, cracking the stone. Men ducked, ears ringing. Lee shouted over the blast, "Hold that gate. They want it. Make them earn it." Gamelin fired once, cleanly. A figure fell in the brush. He reloaded with surprising speed for his age. Reynaud watched him from behind a crate and muttered, "I think the general just found his youth." For 2 hours, they traded fire. The SS advanced by inches, only to be driven back again. Smoke turned the morning gray. By noon, the air was thick enough to taste. Then, another lull, longer this time. The forest went quiet except for the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. The defenders crouched behind walls that bled dust. Lee moved from man to man, calm but pale. He poured water into helmets for the wounded, checked magazines, whispered, "Steady now. They'll be back." He was right. At dusk, they came again, sharper, angrier. The tank fired twice more, each blast rattling every rib in the courtyard. One SS team reached the base of the wall, close enough to shout insults. A grenade tumbled back down at them, ending the argument. When darkness fell, the firing slowed, then stopped. The only sound was the groan of stone and the hiss of the tank's cooling engine. Men sagged where they stood. The cook sat down, staring at his hands, black with soot and blood. "We lived," he whispered, as if saying it made it less absurd. Gangle wiped the sweat from his face, leaned his rifle against the wall, and looked toward the tree line. Through the fading light, he saw movement again, headlights, a dozen, maybe more, threading through the forest. "They're bringing reinforcements," he said. His voice was flat, certain. Lee followed his gaze, jaw tightening. "Then we'll be ready." The stars came out over the Alps, small and sharp as nails. Down below, engines growled. The night was just beginning. A German bullet hit a German helmet. The man who fired it wore an American patch. It happened in the first hard minutes after dawn, when fog still clung to the inner yard and the walls sweated dust. A Wehrmacht private popped above the parapet to adjust his field of fire. A sniper's crack from the forest slapped his helmet and sent him sprawling. He blinked, alive by an inch of steel. Below him, the American who had just put 3 rounds into the same Treeline ducked, teeth bared. "Keep your head, Fritz." No mockery in it. Only habit turned into warning. The castle moved like a single body. Germans passed ammo up the stairs. Americans worked the belts. French hands dragged sandbags, hauled water, tore linen into bandages. Somewhere, a kettle boiled without permission, and the smell of tin sour tea drifted across cordite. A Wehrmacht corporal offered a cigarette to a U.S. sergeant with the half-shy shrug of men sharing weather. "Never thought I'd fight next to you," the American said, breath white. "Neither did I," the German answered, tapping ash with one finger. "But I like your cigarettes." The SS came heavier, louder, motorcycles at the gate, boots in the ditch, voices throwing courage at stone. MG-42s hammered the battlements until gargoyles shed noses and centuries. The Sherman in the courtyard exhaled heat, its turret turning like a watch hand. Lee climbed onto the hull. "On me," he called, not shouting, just placing the weight where it needed to be. "They won't take this place. Not today." A Panzerfaust hissed from the Treeline and slammed the outer wall. The echo ran around the yard like a dog off the leash. The gate shook. Shadows surged up the slope, ladders lifting like ribs. The Sherman's coax stitched the base of the wall, splintering rungs, knocking men backward into churned leaves. The tank lurched forward 2 meters, just enough to angle the gun, and fired high. The shell tore a new mouth in the hillside. Earth rained down. A ladder cartwheeled empty. Smoke thickened. Orders dissolved into gestures. 2 fingers. Left, flat palm. Hold. A chop. Down. Barotra sprinted sandbags to the breach like he was back on a court, feet remembering lines that stone could not show. Gamelin knelt, aimed, fired, worked the bolt, a rhythm older than this hour. Reynaud caught spent brass in his hat because it felt like catching something. They reached the gate. A black swarm pressed the timbers, knives at the hinges, hooks biting. Grenades bounced, hissed, spat. The inner plank bowed. Lee dropped from the hull, grabbed a crate, threw it against the brace, and banged the tank's glacis twice with his fist, the agreed signal. Besotten, Jenny snorted forward, armor scraping stone, nose wedging against the gate like a shoulder. Flames licked up the right fender, fuel, cloth, it didn't matter. The loader cursed and beat at the fire with a coat. "Hold!" Lee shouted over the roar. Jenny stays. The machine answered in steel, heat, and stubbornness. Her cokes coughed again, and the pressure outside faltered. Through the smoke, a flash of black sprinted for the breach, an SS man with a satchel charge tucked under his arm. Gangle saw him first. He had been moving the French toward deeper cover, one palm steady on Paul Reynaud's shoulder, the other on the sling of his rifle. He didn't shout. He didn't have time. He stepped into the line of the shot and fired once. The satchel fell short, flared, died. Then a second crack from the woods. Gangle rocked back as if the wall had pushed him. His rifle slipped. He folded down beside Reynaud like a man sitting to rest. Reynaud's hands fluttered, useless, trying to return what couldn't be returned. Major. Gangle's mouth found shape before sound. "Tell my men this was worth it." The breath left him as if the mountain had taken it back. For a heartbeat, the crowd that was the castle went silent in the middle of noise. Even the tank's engine seemed to hiccup. Lee was there at once, not to comfort, there wasn't time, but to confirm. He touched the neck, nodded once, and turned his face toward the gate the way a man chooses forward because backward has closed. "Push them off," he said, and the words cut clean. The line moved. A grenade landed where it should. The MGs clipped the ditch. Ladders bucked and fell. The pressure eased by inches, then feet. The gate stopped bowing and began to breathe again under the tank's weight. Inside, a French minister who had never cursed in public let out a string of words his mother would have denied him. The Czech cook pressed his wrist to his eyes and came away with grit and wet. A.U.S. Sergeant tucked Gangle's logbook, scuffed leather, pencil stubs still inside, into his own jacket, a reflex against forgetting. The SS tried once more at the north wall, a hard, mean push that spent itself against stone and stubbornness. By afternoon the fire slackened, then stuttered into pot shots. The smoke thinned. The mountain light sharpened, making every crack in the masonry honest. Men slid down the inner face of the wall and sat where they landed. No one spoke for a while. They listened to their hands shake. When sound returned, it came from far off, faint at first, like weather. Engines. More than one. Not the nervous cough of motorcycles, but the deeper roll of weight and decision. Heads lifted. Lee stood, eyes narrowing, counting distances the way you count heartbeats between lightning and thunder. "Do you hear that?" someone asked. "Yes," Lee said, "but I don't yet know if it's for us." The forest, holding its answer, breathed out diesel. The men looked at one another across uniforms that had stopped matching, and then back to the tree line where the road twisted out of sight. Help was coming, or more trouble. And the difference, this close to the end of the world, was only a few minutes wide. Dawn came gray and thin, dragging the smell of smoke and wet stone with it. The night's quiet had been a lie. By morning, the castle was nearly out of everything that mattered. 10 men could still fight. 2 couldn't, but refused to lie down. In the valley below, black uniforms swarmed through the trees like ants on sugar. The first shells hit just after sunrise. The MG-42s opened in chorus, hammering the walls until chunks of stone rained onto the courtyard. Mortars followed, walking their explosions closer. The gate shuddered, hinges screaming. Inside, men moved with tired precision, passing belts, water, hope. The tank crew checked their last rounds. "If this is it," Lee said quietly, pacing the wall, "make them pay for every inch." His voice steadied hands. Americans, Germans, Frenchmen, no uniforms mattered anymore. They just loaded and fired, loaded and fired. A Wehrmacht gunner worked the belt for an American bar. The Czech cook fired 1 round every time his breath stopped shaking. The Sherman's coke spat until the barrel glowed dull red. Then silence, save for the ringing in everyone's ears. Smoke poured from the east tower, curling above them like a flag. The SS shouted for surrender, their words lost in the wind. Then, unexpectedly, a song. From the hall, Gamelin's voice rose. Old, cracked, but steady. Allons enfants de la patrie. The others turned to listen. One American hummed along, off-key. The Germans didn't sing. They just watched, faces unreadable. For half a minute, bullets paused for music. The next mortar ended it. The blast tore through the courtyard, slamming men to the ground. "Ammo check," someone shouted. "3 rounds left," came the answer. Lee wiped grit from his face and said, almost to himself, "Then every shot's a reason." The SS climbed closer. You could hear the scrape of their boots on the stone. Grenades arced, bounced, burst. A French minister who hadn't cursed in 20 years let out a string that would have made a priest blush. Barotra sprinted sandbags to the gate like he was playing for match point. The Sherman roared, its last shell tearing a hole in the slope, scattering men and courage alike. They traded fire by seconds, then by single bullets. The Germans inside used empty rifles as clubs. The tank's engine coughed once, then died. "She's done," the loader muttered. "So are we," someone else replied. Lee stood at the parapet, looking over the burning forest. The SS were regrouping for one final push, 200 men against a handful. Then, beneath the gunfire, he heard it, a deep, distant vibration rolling through the valley. Not mortars. Engines. Heavy ones. "Listen," he said. The men froze. The ground itself began to hum. The sound grew until it had weight. Lee climbed onto the wall, scanning the tree line. Dust rose on the lower road. Then, green shapes emerging from the smoke. American tanks, the white stars smeared with mud. For a moment, no one dared to believe it. Then the radios crackled alive. 142nd Armor, approaching from the south. "Hold your fire." The SS broke first. Their lines buckled, officers shouting in panic as the M4s fanned out below, guns lowering in unison. The mountains shook again, this time with deliverance. The black uniforms scattered into the trees, leaving their dead and their flags behind. Inside the castle, no one cheered. Not yet. They simply stood, blinking at the impossible light of safety. The cook sat down, dropped his rifle, and began to cry without sound. Gamelin leaned against a wall that somehow still stood and whispered, "So this is how peace feels." Lee walked to the shattered gate and placed his hand on the burned wood. Outside, the new tanks rumbled closer, their engines low and patient. He looked toward the road, the smoke, the wrecked forest, and then up at the sky, where the clouds were finally breaking. "The war's over," he said softly. But try telling that to history. When the guns went silent, no one cheered. The castle exhaled smoke and dust like a tired animal. Powder hung in the air with the sweetness of burned pine. Hot metal clicked as it cooled. The walls wore fresh freckles of lead, pale scars where stone had torn away. In the courtyard, the tank's engine wound down to a tired sigh. And then there was only breath, ragged, uncertain, human. They counted without speaking. Americans, Germans, Frenchmen, all upright, all looking for faces that should answer back. Some did, some didn't. A helmet rolled once and settled in a puddle that reflected the sky, as if the day were trying to apologize. By the gate lay Joseph Gangle. Dust had settled on his collar, one palm still open toward the doorway he'd tried to hold. They carried him gently, as if any jolt could undo the decision he had already made for them all. Someone set his helmet on the Sherman's scorched glassy, high, visible, impossible to ignore. "He fought like one of us," Sergeant Lee said, the words rough from smoke and restraint. "He was one of us," the captain answered, and the correction landed like a benediction. No bugle, no prayer, just men stepping back to give space to something they did not know how to name. A German private removed his field scarf and folded it under the dead officer's head. An American corporal tugged the tank's tarp forward to cover the worst of it. The gesture traveled across uniforms the way warm water spreads in cold. They began the work that comes after courage. Tourniquets, splints, iodine dabbed with hands that trembled only afterward. The French, whose names had filled newspapers before the war and lists afterward, moved among the wounded with bowls of water and what authority still lived in their voices. A former prime minister knelt in mud to hold a German boy's wrist while a bandage was tightened, saying nothing, just counting beats with the soft syllables of a language that had once ordered armies and now kept time for pain. From a diary written that night in a tight, ornate hand, I did not believe in God before that morning. But someone, surely, was looking at us from there above, and perhaps smiling, not for victory, but because men forgot themselves long enough to remember one another. The tank crew opened their last canteen and poured into tin cups, passing them along the parapet. The Czech cook found the kettle, blackened and dented, and held it over a tongue of surviving flame until the thin water turned the color of weak tea. He spooned sugar into one cup, then stopped, then spooned it back out. Some habits were luxuries that didn't fit the hour. Across the yard, on a broken step, Gamelin sat with his rifle across his knees like a walking stick. His hands were steady now, calmer than they had been when bullets still argued. Reynaud stood beside him and said something that made the old general look away quickly. The tennis champion leaned his head against the cool stone and closed his eyes, as if listening for a crowd that would never sound like this. The quiet lengthened until it had weight. The mountain wind worked its way through the gate's new cracks, bringing the smell of churned earth and wet leaves. A flag lay where it had fallen from the parapet, a field of color suddenly without a job. No one moved to lift it. They took stock. The radios, silent. The ammunition crate, almost polite in its emptiness. The gate, blackened and braced by a machine that had become a doorstop. Above them, the sky went a color it only finds after fires, hard, clean, indifferent. Someone laughed once, too high, and clapped a hand over his mouth in apology to the dead. When the first villagers crept up the road, they stopped at the edge of the yard, not sure what language could explain what they were seeing. Germans passing morphine to Americans, Americans tightening a sling on a German arm, Frenchmen carrying a litter made from a door and a torn bedsheet. The villagers removed their hats and stood as if outside a church. They made space for a small ceremony. Not a burial, only a promise. Lee placed his palm on Gangel's logbook through the fabric of his jacket. "We'll tell them," he said, mostly to the ground, "even if they don't want to hear." The German private who had worked the bar belt nodded once, eyes rimmed red but dry. "We're Warden es Urselen," he said. "We will tell it." Night shrank and thinned toward morning. Men slept where they sat, heads against stone, hands still curled around nothing. The tank cooled to a memory of heat. An owl called once from the woodline, curious, then thought better of it. At first light, engines approached, the slow, boxy thrum of American columns moving with the confidence of orders that had finally caught up. The new arrivals climbed the last turn with antennas cutting the mist and white stars smeared by travel. They braked at the gate and stared. In the courtyard, they saw a scene no briefing had prepared them for. A Wehrmacht guard sharing a blanket with a GI. A French dignitary pouring water for a wounded German. A dead German major honored by an American tank and guarded by the men he had chosen to fight. No one spoke. Boots scuffed stone. A captain from the relief column took off his helmet and held it in both hands, as if tipping it to a story that hadn't learned how to be told. And all at once, the mountains seemed to lean in to hear the first attempt at an explanation. They sent a report to headquarters. It went out with the same carbon copies and tired signatures as every other dispatch that week. Time, location, enemy strength, result. Castle Itter, engagement concluded. Friendly casualties, moderate. Enemy, dispersed. It crossed a desk at division, picked up a stamp that thudded like an afterthought, and came back with a note that might as well have been a laugh. Check your facts. Germans don't fight with Americans. Paper prefers straight lines. The days after the battle refused to be straight. Statements were taken on wooden chairs in a schoolroom that smelled of chalk and iodine. The clerk asked who fired first, who repositioned the tank, who gave the orders. He did not have a blank for the part where a German major died shielding a French statesman, or where a cook learned to shoot by aiming at breath instead of uniforms. The official log of the 23rd read like a tax receipt. Local operation. Enemy remnants. Defensive action successful. Not a word about a handshake on a mountain road, or belts of ammunition fed by the hands that once fed them bullets across a different front. The archive swallowed it all politely. Sometimes the biggest stories are the ones even the victors don't believe, Sergeant Joseph Jack McHale wrote in 1946 to a buddy headed home. He'd tucked a small photograph into the envelope. A courtyard of bullet-chopped stone, a tank with scorched paint, a helmet sitting on the glacis like a crown that knew better than to glow. The letter made it to Ohio. The photo ended up in a drawer with tax stamps and dry seeds. Meanwhile, Europe celebrated. Cities lit with candles and jam jars, flags like fresh laundry in the wind, dancers turning streets into rooms and strangers into cousins. The radios choked on parades and speeches. The wires hummed with schedules, not orders. In the Tyrol, there was no parade. The villagers came up the hill in their Sunday coats. A priest spoke softly without naming sides. They buried a German officer near a temporary GI grave where the earth had already learned the weight of men who had been told, and told, and told. Someone placed flowers from a tired orchard, sweet with a bruise. A woman from Wurgel set a ribbon on the mound and said, "For Mutt, for courage," to no one in particular. The relief column's captain tried to write a coherent account for Corps headquarters. He crossed out sentences that sounded like sympathy and numbers that sounded like lies. He settled on this: castle secured with assistance from local German elements. The phrase was legal and empty. He folded it around the fact that his men had seen a French dignitary pour water for a wounded Wehrmacht private while a GI held the boy's head. There was no form for that. Word built the wrong kind of gravity. A staff major asked why an American unit had allowed enemy combatants to keep weapons inside a U.S. controlled perimeter. A colonel in public affairs suggested omitting the incident from the division summary to avoid confusion. Confusion was the truth's only honest uniform. It fit badly and pinched everywhere. In the castle, the men who had lived it were already scattering back into their assigned histories. The French left with escorts and a suitcase of statements. Their names would reappear in newspapers with older arguments attached. The Germans returned to Wurgel to keep civilians from being shot in the last hours of a war that was no longer happening. The Americans moved on to a new map square where the day could be measured in miles again. The tank crew cleaned soot out of places soot doesn't belong and pretended the smell of sugar on the morning air was just spring. At division headquarters, a clerk clipped the Castle Itter report to a stack labeled miscellaneous. Mayen slid it into a drawer that would be opened next time someone needed blank paper. 2 decades later, the drawer would be emptied into a cardboard box, and the box into a basement with a leak, and the basement into a truck bound for a place with no windows. History prefers vaults. Memory prefers kitchens. Years passed. Men pressed new creases into their lives. The road up to the castle narrowed back into a tourist lane. More flags were hung for newer reasons. Then, in a small archive where a volunteer fought dust with a handkerchief and a stubborn kindness, someone opened a thin envelope stamped with a unit seal that had lost its color. Inside, a brittle report, a map with a coffee ring, and a photograph nobody could place. An American flag in the background. In the foreground, a line of tired faces, GIs in borrowed smiles, and beside them a German soldier holding a cup, shoulder to shoulder, everybody squinting into sunlight. The volunteer turned the photo over. On the back, in a hand that had learned neatness from the army and humility from the mountain, a line. Itter, May 45, brothers for one day. He lifted his head toward the reading room, heart hurrying at the idea that a story might still be walking around, looking for a door. The photograph fit in a palm. Sunlight washed the faces into squints. A tank filled the background like a tired animal. In the front row, a GI held a cup, and beside him a German soldier did the same. Someone had written on the back, in a neat, unambitious hand, Itter, May 45, brothers for one day. The paper crackled like dry leaves when it bent, and the room where it was found smelled of dust, old glue, and the kind of quiet that takes notes. It had begun as a minor action in the wires and ended as a rumor in the archives. But the men who lived it kept their own records. Captain John Lee wrote later on hotel stationery because army paper felt too official for what he meant to say. We didn't fight for orders. We fought because it was right. The line underlined itself in the way ink sometimes does when a hand won't stop pressing. One of the French prisoners, his name once printed in heavy type, now just a signature, scribbled in a diary the size of a wallet. Sometimes humanity is the most dangerous weapon. He underlined humanity, then crossed out the underline, maybe embarrassed by the sermon and leaving the sentence to stand on its legs. The castle settled back into stone. Visitors would come for the view and the odd footnote about a last battle that happened after the war had supposedly ended. They would touch a wall and feel grit. They would look over the gate where wood had bowed and imagine a tank wedged there like a shoulder refusing to give. The wind would carry pine and the faint, sour smell of old smoke, the sort of ghosts that don't frighten, only inform. In Wurgel, the townspeople chose a shorter record, a street sign. Joseph Gangelstrasse. Simple black letters on white enamel, mounted where children learn to ride bicycles and old men compare weather to the past. Each year in May, someone leaves flowers at the base of the pole. Not a ceremony, exactly. More a chore that turned into a promise. The stalks lean, the ribbon fades, the name stays. Lee went home. So did most of the others. They folded into jobs that didn't require a helmet. Rail yards, garages, schools, kitchens. Now and then a letter crossed the Atlantic. Stiff English softened by German courtesy, French politeness learning to live with brevity. The letters talked about crops and daughters and roofs. None of them could explain the hour when uniforms lost jurisdiction and men did what was necessary. For a while, nobody believed the story enough to publish it whole. Reports listed tonnage, numbers of prisoners, miles advanced. Not the part where an American sergeant warmed a German boy's hand between both of his, or where a French statesman said thank you to a cook who had just learned to aim. When the photograph surfaced, it traveled like contraband, pocket to pocket, then into a frame on a mantel where no one asked awkward questions at supper. Years cooled the metal. The tank rusted into myth. The castle kept the weather off itself and the memory under it. The road narrowed to a ribbon tourists take slowly, downshifting before the last turn the way the Sherman must have done. From the parapet the world looks modest and survivable. You can watch clouds gathering courage against the ridge and passing through anyway. What remains is smaller than a battle and larger than a footnote. A day when a handful of men ignored the obvious story and wrote another with their bodies. A German major stepped into a shot that wasn't his because a Frenchman at his shoulder needed the next minute. An American captain bet his command on trust. A cook poured weak tea with blistered hands and handed it to whoever reached out first. No monument can hold that logic. Streets and plaques try. They do the tidying that paper loves. The rest belongs to rooms where a photograph lies face down until someone turns it over and sees what it is asking for. One fortress, one day, the shortest peace in the war. And sometimes, to end a war, you stop being an enemy.